You can afford it. That's not the problem. The problem is that spending money on yourself still feels dangerous. Not reckless, not irresponsible, just dangerous. You check the price, you close the tab, you tell yourself, not yet, maybe later, after things feel more settled. But things have settled multiple times now. You've hit milestones you once considered distant. The savings are real, the income is real, the numbers are there. And yet, before almost every purchase that's purely for yourself, there's a moment, a hesitation, a quiet voice that sounds exactly like responsibility saying, this isn't the time. You've been doing this with the smallest things, a better mattress, a decent jacket, booking the restaurant you actually wanted instead of the one that felt financially appropriate, ordering what you're in the mood for instead of the second cheapest option on the menu. And somewhere underneath all that restraint, there's a question you haven't quite said out loud. Why doesn't having enough ever actually feel like enough? By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why, and it has nothing to do with your income, your savings rate, or any lack of discipline. You didn't get here by being careless. You got here by being careful, deliberately, consistently, and in many cases, exhaustingly careful. You learned, probably early and probably for good reason, that money needed to be managed, that the responsible position was always the cautious one, that saying no to yourself wasn't deprivation, it was maturity. It was the behavior that protected you from outcomes you'd either witnessed or felt close enough to fear. For a long time, that belief was accurate. Restraint built stability. Choosing the modest option left room for the important things. Saying no to smaller pleasures felt like saying yes to security. And the discipline worked. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it produced real results that you can point to. So this isn't about whether those habits were appropriate. For most people watching this, they were exactly right for a specific chapter of life. They were the right tool for the conditions that existed at the time. But conditions change, chapters end, and the habits formed inside one set of circumstances tend to outlast that context by years, sometimes by decades. What protected you in one chapter starts quietly working against you in the next. The caution that once created room for growth begins to prevent you from inhabiting what the growth produced. The restraint that was once a reasonable response to real limits becomes a reflex that fires regardless of whether the limits still exist. And this shift happens so gradually, so quietly, that most people never name it, because the behavior still looks correct from the outside. It still receives positive reinforcement. It still produces that brief internal feeling of having done the responsible thing. The pattern doesn't announce that it outlived its purpose. It just continues, now costing you something it was never supposed to cost.
Here's what's actually happening beneath the surface of this. The financial restraint you feel, the hesitation before ordinary purchases, the guilt that appears after reasonable spending, the internal negotiation you conduct before allowing yourself something small, isn't being generated by your current financial situation. It's being generated by a version of your financial situation that no longer exists. Your nervous system learned its financial rules at a specific moment in time. Maybe it was a period of genuine scarcity, months or years when caution was genuinely necessary, when each decision carried real consequence. Maybe it was watching a financial collapse happen close enough to feel its effects, a parent's job loss, a family crisis, a household where money was a recurring source of tension. Maybe it wasn't one event at all. Maybe it was simply the accumulated atmosphere of a household where money was always something to be guarded rather than used, where spending on yourself was implicitly or explicitly connected to risk. Whatever the origin, the brain made a rule, not a conscious, reasoned rule, a survival rule. Spending on yourself is how you end up in trouble. And survival rules don't expire the way conscious beliefs do. You can know, rationally, clearly, that your circumstances have changed. You can look at your savings account and understand that the number there is real and represents genuine security. You can walk through the logical steps and arrive at the correct conclusion that a particular purchase is completely reasonable, and still feel at the moment of transaction that something is slightly wrong. Because the nervous system isn't reading your bank account, it isn't listening to your logical assessment. It's running a program that was written under different conditions, and that program doesn't update itself just because your financial situation does. This is the betrayal that most financially capable people never see clearly. The same psychological system that helped them build stability is now the system that prevents them from experiencing it. You built the house, but the alarm is still calibrated for conditions that no longer exist. And every time the alarm fires, every time you close the tab, choose the cheaper version, decide to wait till later, it feels like wisdom. It feels like discipline. It has the exact texture of a good decision. That's what makes it so difficult to question.
To understand why this is so persistent, it helps to understand something specific about how the mind stores experience. The mind remembers emotional experiences differently than it remembers facts. You might not be able to recall exactly what your family's financial situation looked like during a difficult period. The specific numbers, the exact timeline, those details may be vague or absent. But the felt experience of that time is stored with a precision that facts rarely achieve. The body remembers the tension at the dinner table when an unexpected bill arrived. It remembers the specific quality of silence that preceded a difficult conversation about money. It remembers the particular feeling of wanting something and being told, directly or indirectly, that it wasn't possible. That memory isn't stored as information. It's stored as sensation. And sensation doesn't consult your current bank balance before it activates. You stand there debating a purchase that would not affect your life financially in any measurable way, and somehow your body still reacts like you're risking something important. When you stand in front of a purchase you can easily afford and feel that familiar tightening, that slight internal resistance, that isn't your rational mind calculating risk. That's the stored sensation responding. Your body is treating the current moment as if it resembled the original conditions, not because the conditions are the same, because the emotional pattern recognizes a surface similarity, a transaction, a moment of choosing to spend on yourself, and it fires. The thought that follows feels like reasoning. Not yet, this isn't necessary. I should wait until I feel more secure. It arrives in the voice of wisdom. It has the quality of deliberate judgment. But it isn't deliberate. It preceded deliberation. The sensation came first, and the thought was constructed afterward to explain a feeling that had already been determined. And here's what makes this loop particularly difficult to interrupt. The behavior it produces is genuinely praised. Frugality is treated as a virtue. Choosing the modest option reads as maturity. The person who consistently denies themselves reasonable pleasures is rarely challenged. They are often quietly admired. So the pattern receives reinforcement from two directions simultaneously. Internal reinforcement, through the brief feeling of having done the right thing. External reinforcement through a culture that treats self-denial as evidence of character. Thousands of repetitions, years of reinforcement, until the restraint becomes invisible, until it stops feeling like a pattern you're running and starts feeling like simply who you are. This is the loop. The financial anxiety sensation activates. The thought follows. This doesn't feel safe. The behavior follows. Delay, reduce, deny. A brief feeling of having done the right thing. That feeling reinforces the loop. And the loop runs again in the next ordinary week on the next ordinary purchase. This is what smart money sabotage looks at. Not the obvious mistakes, but the quiet, well-intentioned patterns that persist
precisely because they feel too much like virtues to examine.
The places this appears in daily life are almost never dramatic. That's the point. They're small enough that each one seems unremarkable. You need a new office chair. The one you're using is worn down, visibly so. Your back has been bothering you for months. You've done the research. You know which chair would solve the problem. You can afford it without any meaningful financial impact. But you don't buy it. You tell yourself you'll wait until after the next expense clears, or until the end of the month, or until things feel more settled. A threshold that keeps moving just far enough ahead to stay unreachable. 6 months later, your back still hurts. The chair is still in the tab you've had open since March. There's another version. You're at dinner with people you know. You look at the menu and immediately find the invisible ceiling, the price point above which ordering would feel excessive, not because of what it actually costs relative to your finances, but because of what it would signal to some internal auditor that's been with you so long you've forgotten it's there. You order something you don't particularly want. It costs $11 less than what you were considering. The difference across an entire year of similar moments would not register meaningfully on any financial statement you own. Another version, a trip. You've thought about it. The dates work. Your responsibilities are handled. The cost, measured against your actual financial situation, is entirely manageable. You open the booking page. You close it. You tell yourself you'll look again next week when you have more time to think it through. You don't look again next week. The trip doesn't happen. A different version of it might happen later, in a moment that feels more earned, though you'll struggle to articulate what earning it would actually require. And there's the version with objects. Something in your home that's broken or worn or past its useful life. You manage around it, slightly, practically, without drama. You feel quietly efficient about managing around it. The replacement waits. 4 months, sometimes longer. None of these feel significant individually. They're not meant to. Each one is small enough to dismiss, modest enough to justify, responsible sounding enough to leave unexamined. But they're not separate. They're the same pattern, appearing across every category of your life, week after week, accumulating into something much larger than any single instance suggests.
The cost of this pattern doesn't appear in any financial statement. It won't show up in your net worth calculation. It won't register as a problem in any annual review. No metric will capture it because the most significant things it costs aren't financial. The first cost is presence. When you're in a moment that should be enjoyable, a meal, a trip, an ordinary Saturday that cost money to construct, and part of your attention is still quietly calculating whether you've earned this, whether this is the appropriate level of expenditure, whether you should have chosen something slightly less. You aren't fully inside that moment. You're monitoring it, managing it from a slight distance. This happens so consistently and so quietly that most people stop noticing it. The low-grade background monitoring becomes the normal texture of enjoyment. You assume this is simply how experiences feel, but it isn't. It's the cost of an unresolved pattern running continuously in the background of your conscious experience. The second cost is time. The years during which you had the resources to experience something fully, to take the trip, to buy the thing, to inhabit your present life without perpetually deferring to a more settled future version. Those years don't return. The waiting that felt responsible was sometimes simply waiting. The version of your life that exists right now in this specific configuration of health and energy and relationships and circumstances is temporary in ways that are easy to overlook when you're in the middle of it. And waiting has a cost that no compound interest calculator accounts for. The third cost is subtler, but perhaps the most persistent. It's what happens to your relationship with financial progress when the anxiety doesn't diminish as the progress accumulates. You save more, you invest, the accounts grow, The milestones you once considered distant become real, and somehow the internal experience of security doesn't track the external numbers. The threshold for enough to feel safe keeps moving because the program running wasn't written around a number, it was written around a feeling, and a feeling can't be permanently resolved by a number because it was never really about numbers in the first place.
Think about the last time you spent money on something purely for yourself. Not for a responsibility, not for someone else, not because it was necessary, and felt completely unbothered afterward. No second guessing, no quiet accounting, no small internal note that you probably could have done without it. How long ago was that? What follows are not questions, they're observations. Notice which ones land without resistance and which ones require a moment of defense. You apply a different spending standard to yourself than you do to people you care about. You would spend more on a gift for someone else than on the same thing for yourself, without thinking twice. You experience more ambient financial anxiety during stable periods than during genuinely constrained ones, because during the difficult times, at least the caution made obvious external sense. You have framed restraint as preference so many times that it has become indistinguishable from preference. I don't really need that. That's just not how I spend. I'm not someone who does things like that. You believe these statements, but you formed them inside a pattern that was already running. Quietly, you have replaced things, furniture, clothing, tools, appliances, significantly later than was objectively reasonable. Not because the replacement wasn't affordable, because spending on something that was merely worn out rather than completely failed felt difficult to justify. You feel a specific internal discomfort when someone around you spends on themselves easily and without apparent deliberation. It isn't quite judgment. It's something closer to confusion, a recognition that they're not running the same internal negotiation you would run in the same situation. You have justified spending that's for someone else, for something productive, for something that will eventually be useful. Spending that is simply for the improvement of your present daily life without a utility argument attached is harder, noticeably harder. You have postponed experiences until conditions were right. The conditions have been right for a while now.
Understanding this pattern doesn't immediately change the behavior. That's not how these things work. What it changes is your relationship to the behavior as it happens. Before this kind of clarity, each instance of restraint felt like a genuine choice, a good one, evidence of discipline and good judgment. The pattern was invisible because its outputs looked indistinguishable from wisdom. After clarity, you begin to develop a different ability, the ability to notice in real time which restraint is chosen and which is compulsive, because there is a meaningful difference. Chosen restraint, you have the resources, you've considered the purchase, and you have decided, genuinely decided, that it doesn't serve what you actually want right now. The no comes after engagement. It's free. Compulsive restraint, the discomfort arrives before consideration. The hesitation precedes the decision. The outcome was already determined before you consciously engaged with the choice. From the inside, these two experiences feel nearly identical. The surface texture of the behavior is the same. That's precisely what makes this so difficult to identify without looking closely. Once you can tell the difference, not always, not perfectly, but sometimes, the pattern loses some of its automaticity, not because understanding dissolves old instructions, but because you stop mistaking the compulsion for wisdom, and you stop receiving the same internal reward for behavior that isn't actually a choice. That shift is quiet. It doesn't announce itself, but it changes the relationship between you and the pattern in a way that information alone, the kind that tells you what to do differently, almost never does. You built a life where the original scarcity is no longer real. The mind that learned to survive inside it hasn't fully received that update yet. The gap between what your circumstances actually are and what your nervous system is still preparing for. That's where the self-denial lives. Not in irresponsibility, not in poor planning, in a protection response that outlasted the conditions it was protecting you from. There's only one question worth sitting with after this. The next thing you're waiting to allow yourself, is it waiting for a real reason? Or is it simply waiting because waiting is what you learn to do?